What happened when an undercover CEO discovered that one of his farm workers was secretly living in a barn with her child? You're about to hear a story that will restore your faith in humanity. Hello to our thoughtful and compassionate audience. You're exactly where you need to be. In this emotional journey, a successful farm owner sheds his title to walk among his workers, only to uncover a hidden struggle that changes everything. It's a powerful reminder that real leadership isn't about power. It's about seeing people, hearing their stories, and stepping up when it matters most. Let's dive in. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Meadowbrook Harvest, where rows of kale and sunflowers stretched toward the horizon. From his office window in the main farmhouse, Thomas Everett stared out at the fields he had once tended with his own hands. As the founder of the now thriving organic farm cooperative, Thomas had built Meadowbrook on principles of sustainability, fairness, and community. But as the business expanded, so did the layers between him and the soil, and between him and the people working it. In recent months, whispers had reached him, a few anonymous notes, a quiet conversation at the farmer's market, concerns about exhausted workers, unfair treatment, and even rumors that someone had been sleeping on the property overnight. Thomas had always believed that if you take care of your people, they'll take care of the land. But now he feared something vital had been lost while he was busy managing spreadsheets and distribution deals. He could have called a meeting, launched an internal review, maybe even hired a consultant, but he knew none of that would show him the truth, not really, so he made a decision. For the first time in years, Thomas would return to the fields not as the boss, but as a laborer. Disguised in a faded work shirt and scuffed boots, he would join the seasonal crew under the name Tom, just another hand in the harvest. No titles, no clipboard, just the land, the people, and the reality he had to face. Because if Meadowbrook was losing its soul, he needed to find where it had slipped away and bring it back, one day at a time. Thomas arrived at the break of dawn, dressed in a worn flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his brow. He introduced himself as Tom, a volunteer interested in learning the rhythms of farm life. The morning air was cool, the fields dewy, and the crew was already gathering near the tool shed. There were about a dozen workers, some seasoned, others new, most of them quiet, heads down, conserving energy. The supervisor, Cole, a wiry man with a clipped voice and clipboard in hand, quickly assigned rows and tasks without much small talk. "Stay on pace," he muttered as he passed. Thomas joined a team harvesting zucchinis, working beside a woman who moved quickly and efficiently, but with a noticeable tension in her posture. Her name was Isabel Cruz. She spoke little, focused on her task, but offered a polite nod when Thomas introduced himself. Throughout the morning, he noticed her kindness. She quietly helped another worker who spilled a crate of produce and handed her gloves to a teen whose hands were blistering. Yet there was a heaviness in her eyes that didn't match her gentle demeanor. When the lunch bell rang, Isabel disappeared quickly, skipping the communal meal. Curious, Thomas watched her slip behind the barn, alone. He didn't follow yet. Instead, he looked around and felt a growing discomfort. The energy in the fields wasn't hostile, but it was distant, mechanical. People worked like clockwork, but no one smiled, no one laughed. Meadowbrook was still producing food by the truckload, but at what cost? That evening, Thomas scribbled notes in a small notebook he kept in his pocket. This wasn't the farm he had built. Something vital had withered beneath the surface, and he was here to find out why. The sun had dipped below the hills when Thomas stayed behind to finish washing produce bins behind the barn. Most of the crew had already left for the night, the fields quiet except for the rustling of wind through the trees. As he moved toward the storage area to return some tools, he heard something unexpected. A soft lullaby, barely audible, carried on the evening breeze. Curious, he followed the sound around the side of the barn and up the narrow wooden ladder to the hayloft above. There, tucked behind a row of stacked crates and old equipment, was a small makeshift living space. A few folded blankets, a backpack, a baby bottle resting on a crate. In the center, bathed in dim lantern light, sat Isabel. She was cradling a small child, no older than 2, rocking gently and singing in Spanish, her voice quiet and full of tenderness. Thomas froze, heart clenched. He hadn't expected this. He watched silently for a moment, unwilling to intrude, then quietly backed down the ladder, shaken. The weight of what he'd seen pressed heavily on him as he walked back through the empty fields. Isabel wasn't just working long days, she was surviving, living in secret with her child in a barn, likely afraid of being discovered, likely feeling invisible. That night Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay awake in the old staff cabin he'd borrowed, thinking about all the things Meadowbrook claimed to stand for: community, care, dignity, and yet here was a mother sleeping in hay to keep her daughter close and safe. It wasn't just heartbreaking, it was unacceptable, and more than ever, Thomas knew this wasn't something he could delegate. He had to face it, not later, not through someone else. Tomorrow. The next morning, Thomas approached his tasks with a different weight in his chest. As he trimmed herbs beside the greenhouse, he noticed Isabel working nearby, her movements precise but weary. During their lunch break, he found a quiet moment to sit near her, beneath the shade of an old walnut tree. "You've got a good rhythm out there," he said casually. Isabel glanced up, cautious but polite. "Been doing this kind of work for a long time," she replied softly. Thomas kept his tone gentle. "It's not easy work, especially with everything else." Isabel stiffened slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she was on guard. But after a beat, she let out a tired sigh. "I had no other option. The shelters were full. I couldn't be far from Mia, and I couldn't risk not having a job." Her words were matter of fact, not seeking pity, just truth. She shared a little more. Once a kindergarten teacher, a medical emergency had drained her savings. One setback led to another, and soon she was sleeping in her car, until Meadowbrook offered seasonal work. "This place saved me," she said, eyes focused on the horizon. "But I still feel like I'm one mistake away from losing everything again." Thomas listened in silence, guilt gnawing at him. He had created this farm to help people, to build something good, but somehow Isabel had fallen through the cracks. And how many others had he failed to see? Later that day, he observed other workers more closely. Julio with the limp, Aneka constantly checking her phone like she was managing something far beyond the fields. The signs had always been there. Now he could finally see them, and he couldn't look away anymore. Change had to start, and it had to start with him. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in warm streaks of orange and gold, Thomas walked back toward the barn with purpose. He carried a lantern in one hand and a bundle of fresh produce in the other: tomatoes, peaches, a loaf of bread from the kitchen. Reaching the loft, he gently climbed the ladder and knocked against the wooden beam. Isabel looked up from where she sat, her daughter asleep beside her. Her eyes didn't show fear, only resignation. "I knew eventually someone would find out," she said quietly. "But I couldn't leave her. I couldn't risk losing the job." Thomas set down the food without a word, then took off his hat. "You don't have to hide anymore," he said gently, "and you don't have to do this alone." Isabel blinked, her breath catching. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because I'm not just Tom," he said, voice steady. "I'm Thomas Everett. I own this farm." A beat of silence stretched between them. Isabel's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Thomas continued, "I created Meadowbrook to be a place of safety and dignity. And somehow, we failed you. I failed you." Her eyes filled with quiet shock and disbelief. "You don't owe me anything," she said, trembling. "But I do," he replied. "I owe you what I promised every person who ever came to work this land: respect, support, and humanity." The next morning, Thomas arrived at the fields dressed not as a laborer, but in his old denim jacket embroidered with the Meadowbrook logo. As the crew assembled, he cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin today, there's something we need to talk about." The moment had come, not just to confront what was broken, but to begin mending it. The crew gathered in the courtyard, boots dusty, brows furrowed, unsure of what to expect. It wasn't every day the farm owner called a meeting at dawn. Thomas stood before them, not behind a podium, not flanked by managers, just one man in a well-worn jacket, holding a clipboard he didn't plan to read from. "I came back to the fields this season under a different name," he began, his voice steady. "I wanted to see how things were really going, and what I found broke my heart." A hush fell over the group. He didn't mention Isabel by name, but he spoke of workers pushing through exhaustion, of someone sleeping in a barn to stay close to their child, of silence born from fear, faces lowered, others exchanged surprised, knowing glances. Then came Cole, the field supervisor, arms crossed tightly. "With respect," he said, "we've been doing what it takes to keep production moving. No one complained directly. We have quotas to hit." Thomas nodded, but his gaze was firm. "I understand that. But when people stop speaking up, it doesn't mean things are fine. It means they've given up on being heard." He announced immediate changes: a confidential feedback line, paid wellness days, and an emergency housing partnership with a nearby nonprofit. "We'll also start rotating breaks, increase support for single parents, and create leadership roles from within the team." For a moment, no one spoke. Then quietly, one worker began to clap. Another followed. A ripple of applause spread across the crowd, not thunderous, but genuine. The silence had finally been broken. Thomas exhaled, not in relief, but in readiness. The hard work was just beginning, but at least now they'd be doing it together, with open eyes, open hearts, and a renewed purpose, rooted in respect. Later that afternoon, Thomas knocked gently on the barn door with a different kind of offer. He handed Isabel a set of keys and motioned toward a small, unused guest cottage nestled near the orchard. "It's yours, for as long as you need it," he said softly. Isabel hesitated, the weight of pride and survival etched into every movement. "I can't accept charity," she murmured, eyes downcast. Thomas shook his head. "This isn't charity, it's restoration. It's giving you what you've always deserved, but were never offered." Slowly, cautiously, she took the keys. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Isabel and her daughter Mia slept on a real bed with clean sheets, the soft hum of crickets outside instead of the rustling of hay. The cottage was simple: one bedroom, a small kitchen, a porch overlooking rows of apple trees. But to Isabel it felt like a palace. Over the following days, she began to bloom. She helped staff the farmers' market booth on weekends, taught fellow workers how to preserve produce, and even offered to lead a morning stretch circle before field work. People began to see her not as a burden or a mystery, but as a source of strength and knowledge. Nia was placed in a nearby child care program that partnered with the farm, and each afternoon she ran through the rows of sunflowers, giggling as she chased butterflies. Thomas watched from a distance sometimes, heart full. This wasn't just a second chance for Isabel. It was a second chance for the farm, too. Meadowbrook was beginning to heal, one act of trust at a time, and in the quiet joy that now filled the air, Thomas knew this was what the farm was always meant to be. The weeks that followed marked a quiet revolution at Meadowbrook. What began as isolated changes blossomed into a full cultural shift. Thomas, now fully re-engaged in daily operations, restructured the leadership model, inviting workers to join weekly planning meetings and rotating crew leads based on collaboration, not just speed. Isabel was officially hired as the farm's community liaison, a new role designed to support workers facing hardships and connect them with resources. She helped Julio, a field hand who had been sleeping in his truck, transition into the farm's newly converted bunkhouse. She also advocated for flexible shifts for single parents and facilitated access to local health clinics. At first, some were skeptical. Change had come too suddenly, too generously. But when they saw Thomas listening at eye level, when they saw Isabel guiding with quiet confidence, trust began to take root. Even Cole, the once dismissive supervisor, started to shift. One morning, after a long harvest, he lingered near the crew as Isabel handed out cold lemonade. "You know," he muttered, "this way's not bad." She smiled, offering him a cup. Meanwhile, productivity didn't drop, it soared. Happy workers were more focused, more willing to help each other. Local vendors began to comment on the new energy radiating from Meadowbrook's staff. Visitors sensed it too. The laughter between rows, the stories exchanged over lunch, the bulletin board now filled with thank you notes and community updates. Meadowbrook was no longer just a place to grow vegetables, it was a place to grow dignity, purpose, and connection. As Thomas looked out over the fields, now full of both crops and conversation, he realized that rebuilding a culture wasn't about rewriting policies, it was about remembering people. And finally, he was remembering them all. Word of the changes at Meadowbrook began to ripple beyond the farm's fences. One afternoon, a local journalist named Marissa stopped by the market stand, intrigued by murmurs of a farm that had not only improved working conditions but transformed lives. After observing the energy and unity among the staff, she requested an interview. At first, Isabel hesitated. She had spent so long in survival mode, avoiding attention. But Thomas encouraged her gently. "Your story could be the seed that helps someone else grow," he said. With quiet strength, Isabel agreed. Sitting on the porch of her cottage, with Mia playing nearby, she spoke openly about her journey. From teacher to farm worker, from hidden struggle to leadership, she didn't dramatize or embellish, she simply told the truth. The article titled, "From Barn Loft to Board Meetings, A Farm's Journey to Compassion," quickly went viral. The response was overwhelming. Donations flowed in from readers across the country, many asking how they could support other workers like Isabel. Inspired by the outpouring, Thomas established the Meadow Fund, a nonprofit initiative aimed at offering emergency assistance, housing, and advocacy for farm workers statewide. Farms from neighboring towns reached out, eager to learn how they could replicate Meadowbrook's model. But amid the media buzz and newfound recognition, Thomas remained grounded. For him, the real victory was watching Isabel speak with pride, seeing Mia run freely, and knowing that honesty had sparked healing. The farm didn't become perfect overnight, but it had become visible, accountable, and rooted once more in humanity. And that, more than any headline or praise, was what mattered most. As Thomas watched Isabel answer questions from a student reporter, he smiled quietly. Her voice, once hidden in the rafters, was now helping others find theirs. Autumn settled gently over Meadowbrook, turning the fields gold and amber, the trees lining the orchard ablaze with color. The final harvest festival approached, a tradition meant to celebrate the season's end, but this year, it felt like something more. There was laughter as tables were set along the rows, jars of homemade jam and baskets of fresh produce arranged with care. Children chased each other through the grass, their joy echoing in the crisp air. Isabel stood at the edge of the gathering, Mia balanced on her hip, waving shyly at familiar faces. Her once wary smile had bloomed into something bright and steady. Thomas joined her with 2 mugs of cider, handing her one. "You've built something incredible here," she said. He chuckled softly. "We did. The harvest wasn't just in the soil this year, it was in the people. In the restored dignity of tired hands, in the softened tone of Cole as he complimented a new crew member, in the way workers stayed a little longer after their shift just to sit and talk. The Meadow Fund had helped 3 other farms launch worker support programs, and partnerships with local schools and shelters were underway. But what filled Thomas's heart most wasn't policy or progress. It was watching Mia laugh as she danced barefoot in the pumpkin patch, surrounded by a community that now saw her and her mother as part of their family. A small plaque had been added to the barn that read, "Every life we grow is part of the harvest." As the sun dipped below the hills, casting long golden rays over the farm, Thomas felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Meadowbrook had found its soul again, not in perfection, but in compassion, and this time it would never be buried. The story of Meadowbrook Harvest teaches us that true leadership is rooted in compassion, not control. Thomas Everett, a successful farm owner, rediscovers this truth when he goes undercover and sees firsthand the quiet struggles of his employees, especially Isabel, a single mother living in a barn with her child. Rather than respond with shame or bureaucracy, he chooses empathy and action. By listening, confronting the uncomfortable, and creating space for healing, Thomas transforms not just one life, but the culture of an entire community. The lesson is clear. Policies alone can't create dignity. People do. When we slow down enough to truly see others, when we choose kindness over convenience, we open the door for lasting change. Isabel's journey reminds us that those facing hardship aren't weak, they're resilient. And sometimes, the most powerful way to lead is to walk beside someone quietly until they find their voice again. Meadowbrook becomes a living example that no business, no matter how successful, can thrive if its people are suffering. But with heart, humility, and a willingness to grow, it can become something far greater. A home. In the end, the harvest that matters most isn't in the soil, it's in each other.